So our next talk is by Lina Džuverović. The title of her lecture is Historicizing and Archiving Collectivity, Collaborative Actions, Continued Omissions, a Feminist Revisiting of Yugoslav Collectives in the 1970s. And I'll say a few words about Lina. Lina Džuverović is a curator and lecturer in arts policy and management at Birkbeck College at the University of London. Her research focuses on ways in which the sphere of contemporary art can become a site of solidarity and community building. Previously, she taught at the University of Reading and at other institutions. And as I said before, her lecture today will concern a feminist revisiting of Yugoslav neo-avant-gardism. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So hi, thank you for inviting me, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to hear so many amazing presentations and also to catch up with lots of friends, which I've started to do already. And I will begin with questions of methodology to respond to this opening panel in relation to methodologies to do with institutionalization and archives relating to collective practice. When writing about the formation of artist groups in the Bloomsbury fraction in 1980, British literary critic Raymond Williams observed that the real point of social and cultural analysis of any developed kind is to attend not only to the manifest ideas and activities, in this case of artist groups, but also to the positions and ideas which are implicit or even taken for granted. His critique in this case was that at that point we hadn't developed appropriate tools for the study of artists or cultural groups. He talks about larger institutions, but that somehow the study of artist groups evades us. Williams was writing in reference to the Bloomsbury group, which is a group of associated English writers, intellectuals, philosophers, including Virginia Woolf, Vanessa Bell, John Maynard Keynes, etc., in connection with a quote by its member, the author and political theorist Leonard Woolf, in which Woolf characterized the Bloomsbury group as simply being a group of friends. So he says, what came to be called Bloomsbury by the outside world never existed in the form given to it by the outside world. For Bloomsbury was and is currently used as a term, usually of abuse, applied to a largely imaginary group of persons with largely imaginary objects and characteristics. We were and always remain primarily and fundamentally a group of friends. So Woolf challenges the imposed readings on the group by what he calls the outside world, and Williams initially includes this quote and ends it with a reference to this group simply being a group of friends. Later in the text, he repeats the quote, but adds to it one simple sentence. Our roots and the roots of our friendship were in the University of Cambridge. And this immediately changes how we read what was hitherto perceived as a simple statement about a loose and informal association of those involved with the Bloomsbury group. The addition of Cambridge University immediately situates the group for the reader in terms of cultural, economic, and social capital, instantly shifting from this being just any group of friends with shared interests and some interesting ideas to a very specific social and cultural institution, and a group of people whose creative activities cannot be read outside of the sociocultural meanings of Cambridge University. The embedded class marker, a group with enormous cultural capital and a lasting legacy. Besides the fact that, of course, that was, at that time, it was only the male members of the Bloomsbury group that could study at Cambridge. The female members studied at King's. In thinking about Yugoslav collectives in the 60s and 70s in this text, and more broadly in this research project, it is precisely the method of analysis that looks outside manifest ideas and activities to investigate the implicit positions and ideas that I'm interested in. My argument is that there is a need to put under pressure the resistance mechanisms of the Yugoslav avant-garde, resistance against institutionalization, against singular authorship, etc., which led to the formation of many collectives. So my argument is that there is a need to put this resistance under pressure in light of their deeply embedded, internalized patriarchal structures. My research into Yugoslav collectives, into Yugoslav practices over the past decade has been filled with images of either predominantly male or entirely male collectives, starting from the beginning of the 20th century. And we have a few images here. Frequently, the narrative around the collectives in my series of interviews has often ended with conversations such as, yes, we know, the art world was very sexist, it was a different time. The idea that female artists in collectives, groups, clusters of artists played a secondary or supporting roles is deeply ingrained in how we think of collective practice throughout the 20th century. This is frequently articulated as an awareness of an accepted necessary evil of the heteronormative patriarchal 20th century art canon, which is in need of urgent revision, we all agree. For example, in Maria Lind's text, Complications on Collaboration, Agency, and Contemporary Art, she states, even the lone artist in their studio is dependent upon contributions from others. This is especially true for many male artists who have been able to rely on more or less invisible support from surrounding women. Having said that, the process, just to end there, she then continues to talk about collectives, but this is simply a sentence that refers to these surrounding women. Having said that, the processes of collaboration and questions of collective versus single authorship are far from neglected. On the one hand, we see numerous exhibition projects shedding light on those overlooked female artists through finally showcasing the work which should have been seen a long time ago, such as, for instance, just to point to some of the most obvious, the recent Barbican exhibition of Lee Krasner's work, and the exhibition Modern Couples, Art, Intimacy, and the Avant-Garde, which looked into artist couples, also at the Barbican. But this is frequently centered on art world's hunger for more geniuses, even if these days they have to be female. On the other hand, most recently we have an enormous body of scholarly work on collective practice, participation, etc., such as the writing of Claire Bishop, Gregory Cholette, Ellen Mara de Wachter on co-art, collaborative art, Maria Lind, previously mentioned, as well as feminist work on collective practice, such as the group work network, organized by colleagues at Goldsmiths Courtauld at Cambridge, that I'm involved with, which has been meeting in the UK for the past year or so. But rarely are the two discourses, the recovery of under-researched artists and the work on collectives, in conversation with each other. One being centered on recovery of neglected artists, the other on collective practice. But not enough work has been done on those female protagonists who did not pursue singular authorship, but those whose input into collective endeavors remained written out of historical narratives. Even less work has specifically focused on Yugoslav collective practices in the context of female creativity. While I fully acknowledge the excellent feminist work of colleagues such as Suzana Milevska, Jelena Petrovic on women's authorship in interwar Yugoslavia, as well as the curatorial work of the Red Mind Collective, the work of Ivana Bago, Antonia Majača, Chiara Bonfiglioli on the conference Drugca Žena, the work of Sanja Ivekovic and her work with many collectives, including Electra, as well as the work of the Center for Women's Studies in Zagreb, little attention has been paid specifically to the problem of gender bias in collective practice in the region. So this all led to a need to investigate collaboration, to understand better not only implicit positions and relations in terms of how these groups are historicized, but also to seek within the collectives themselves a broader spectrum of voices. Those who were readily seen and accepted as providing support, and being in the orbit of the collective, but certainly not being the creative leads of the work. So this research has two parallel tracks into how protagonists of collectives articulate their own roles and agency, and in parallel an investigation into the historicization of these collectives. So this is broadly how the project Collective Actions and Continued Omissions first began. And my main interest, and I will just say this briefly, lies in three groups or three constellations of artists around the period of the 70s, if they are constituted at all. These are the artists who work together, so I will just move on to some other examples of collective practices. So, my three focal points are the artists associated with the Belgrade Student Cultural Center, opened in 1971, artists associated with the Podrum, the Working Community of Artists, a project in Zagreb, Croatia, and the OHO group, which later became the Šempas family. I'm interested, and here I am showing the slide from the contact collection to show, in part to show the way that the authorship is articulated. So there's sort of two tiers. So I'm interested in the diversity of ways in which these three constellations of artists together use different strategies of collectivity to challenge the imperative of audiences, public exhibitions, institutionalization, the difference in their articulation or the lack of their group activities, but also the different ways in which the female protagonists engaged with the groups, in each case being central but also marginal in a range of ways. So for the purpose of this text, I will focus on the group OHO through a textual analysis as well as interviews with protagonists involved in Yugoslav art scene for some years now. I've been conducting interviews for some time now, and I am now selecting just from a small sample of transcribed interviews so far. It's a long-term process, and it's going to take a while. So from a small sample of transcribed interviews so far, as well as other material, the focus of this paper is on different conceptions of what constitutes authorship versus what constitutes participation, and the gendered nature of these ideas. I now have a paragraph on the group OHO, which, given the nature of this audience, I will probably skip. But it's just worth saying that OHO were formed in 1962 in Kranj, then Yugoslavia, and in 71 the group shifted into working under the title The Šempas Family, which was about bringing art and life into one. So moving on to some of the interviews, in discussions with protagonists of the group, and here I'm drawing on other interviews, not only interviews with members of OHO, but also art historians and curators. The first observation is the linguistic discomfort in talking about female members of the collectives. In discussing the roles of female protagonists in the group with those who have written about them, as well as the protagonists themselves, it quickly becomes apparent that there is an instant shared understanding of the gender difference in collective practice, but that the language around it has not been fully articulated in order for the interviewees to speak about this topic comfortably. Terms like lateral women, bočne žene in Serbian, backing singers, the soul of the collective, everyone's mother, are the terms that have come up in my interviews from a range of perspectives. These terms point to the implied affective labor and the imposed nurturing roles in which the women become caretakers and surrogate mothers by default. We are reminded of Lucy Lippard's observation made in 71, in which she states that it is far easier to be successful as a woman critic, curator, or historian than as a woman artist, since these are secondary or housekeeping activities, considered far more natural for women than the primary activity of making art. The nurturing role was foregrounded in the first interview I held in 2014 with David Nez, a member of the group OHO, in which I asked about the issue of authorship versus participation in OHO. So my question is, I see many women in OHO performances and films, but no women are credited as OHO members. What is the distinction between OHO membership and participation? How come we do not see a wider set of names as authors? His response, and I haven't got a slide of it, I will just read it. He says, that's a really good question. I don't know. We just never had any women. They always played more of a supportive role. Maybe that was just the 60s. It wasn't until feminism that women started coming out and having a voice. I mean, you could say that we were the continuity of the same old patriarchal model. He then goes on to say, I had a girlfriend, and she was always kind of jealous of OHO, but she was never part of the inner circle. We just had a strong bond between us, the 4 or 5 of us. Marika was always, and he's referring to Marika Pogacnik, who is somebody I then go on to interview. Marika was always the soul, in a sense. She'd invite everyone for dinner. She was like everybody's mother. She was like my mother, like my surrogate mother, you know? And so I respond, yes, nurturing, supportive, and kind. The relegation of women's roles to that of carers and the transposition of familiar roles onto the collective is also articulated in the way that Marko Pogacnik, one of the core members of the group, explains in an interview I held with him last summer of how the collective functioned in the early days. He invokes private and public spheres through a spatial analogy. That is yin and yang. Something is towards the internal life of a group. It's not just the wives and friends, but others that were part of this circle that was facing internally, and facing outwardly were the men. Internally, women had the main role, facing outwards were the men. And there is some sense in that in the end. He then goes on to state that later this changed, and in their later works, they searched for an equilibrium as part of their way of the unity of art and life, about the works made as part of the Shempas family in which the women and children were involved. He says that changed. Later we were not happy with that. That was one of the reasons why we formed a commune. There was shared moment at the center. We then moved on to works where women and children took part too. For example, the mobiles made of wool and wood, clay and steel. Shempas family, in Shempas family, that was life/work in the fields and the workshops with clay and wool. We tried to find an ideal way to achieve equilibrium. Pogacnik's quest for an equilibrium and his interrogation of gender roles is especially pertinent in the context of the work he was making at the time. And I'm particularly interested in his series of comics, which I have written about elsewhere, as some of the earliest proto-feminist work in Yugoslavia, which, whilst I aim not to focus on the individual works in this text, these works entitled Tinza and Juno are particularly relevant to this context. So I will just very briefly say a couple of words about them and then move on to further interviews. So these were comic strips in a journal called Problemi, a periodical for psychoanalytic theory and philosophy based in Ljubljana. They were published in 1969, and a series of comics. So in the series of comic strips by Pogacnik, published in Problemi, entitled Juno and Tinza, which are both female names, they are amongst many comic strips that he published. And these two stand out as clearest examples of his engagement with the problematic of gender in Yugoslavia. There were unusual interventions at the time for two reasons. Firstly, the fact that they were authored by male artists who found it necessary to articulate sexism and point to the double standards of Yugoslav society via this particular lens is unique. And secondly, the comic strips stand out because of their feminist tone in an environment which had no experience of feminism. Thank you. As a social movement at that point. So I will just move on to conclude. So Pogacnik's, in my interview with Pogacnik back in 2004, he spoke of these works as attempts to address the hypocrisy of patriarchy. The society of the 60s, I quote, the society of the 60s is on both sides of the Iron Curtain, pretended always to hold to the highest moral standards, but in effect, this was just an illusion. With different comics, I tried to portray this false morality and even show its awkward nature. Especially, I was interested in the twisted role of women who supposedly were proclaimed as free human beings, but in effect, they were, and to a certain degree, even nowadays, an object in the hands of the masculine ruling class. The works and Pogacnik's articulation of these works clearly show an attempt to grapple with the issue of gender, but it is also evident that the language and the means to do so are effectively lacking at the time. Authorship versus participation, and I'm just coming to a conclusion here. What transpires in the work of Aho is a broad spectrum of understandings of what constitutes authorship versus what constitutes participation in group activities. The defining traits of authorship in Aho center on the overarching concept, while the execution and realization are seen to be in the realm of participation. An example of these hierarchies can be seen in these titles of the work White People, 69 to 70, in which the author of the work, Nashko Križnar, with a host of collaborators working on the script, is cited as authors, while the other participants are listed as bodies. To return to the interview with David Nez, following his initial comments about Marika Pogacnik as a surrogate mother, he goes on to say, yes, but she wasn't really an artist. And I asked him, she didn't think of herself in that way? Yes, but she was very talented in terms of craft and sewing and all that, and collaborated a lot with Marco. And she has since then assumed very much a role of collaborator. The presence, yet simultaneous invisibility, is evident, for instance, in the interview with Marko Pogacnik done by Betty Žerovc, art historian Betty Žerovc, in Art Margins, in which Marika Pogacnik is clearly involved in the making of the work, as well as in decision-making. Clearly, the presence of Marika Pogacnik is prominent, but what agency does she possess? And these are quotes from the interview in which he talks about the two of them collaborating and making a fairly big decision not to pursue the sort of direction of conceptual art, but move more into art as life. And so just to conclude, at this point I realize I've been speaking about the women of Aho and have so far only quoted male protagonists. I should say a few words about the interviews and the interview I conducted with Marko and Marika Pogacnik and the process involved. And just ending with this quote by Marika herself. So the process of conducting the interview and the dynamics of the different roles play out in Marika's reluctance to be interviewed. The interview unfolded in their house in Šempas last August, and within minutes of me arriving, Marko took the lead, and I occasionally interjected, directing directly questions to Marika. The interview started with them asking me several times whether Marika really needed to be there, and it is clear that they would rather I spoke to Marko only. When I insisted in Marika's stay, she did remain for the duration of the interview, but it was Marko who mostly spoke. She also frequently got up to tend to the food that was being cooked. Her tone was filled with humor, and as a way of explaining her reluctance, she said, I'm a very bad speaker. I'm a good worker, but a bad speaker. So it is all divided. Some of us work, some of us speak. While Marko adds, without her, nothing would work. In conclusion, I will close with just some ideas how perhaps we may go about tackling the project of historicizing collectivity from a feminist perspective. And I just want to highlight a question asked by Griselda Pollock, which is, what kind of art history does history allow us to write? While my research into collective practice and insistence of unpicking the workings of these groups, here Aho in particular, may seem an imposed feminist revision upon a set of fluid, ever-changing and elusive artist activities under deliberately slippery umbrellas of collectivity, the importance of doing this work lies in the insistence that the nuances and complexities of collectivity should not be simplified for the purpose of art history's easy and palatable means. I have a bit more, but I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lina, for this provocative, important lecture.